Tom Pendergast never held elected office. He gave up his seat on the city council in 1916 and never ran for anything again. Not mayor, not alderman, not so much as a spot on the Parks Board. And yet for roughly 15 years, from the mid-1920s through 1939, he ran Kansas City, Missouri, with a grip so total that no building went up, no contract was signed, no judge took the bench, and no precinct captain sneezed without his knowledge. He did this from a small second-floor office at 1908 Main Street, a two-story yellow brick building, nothing grand, with a linen supply company on the ground floor, where on any given morning you could find a line of men stretching out the door and down the block, waiting to ask him for a job, a favor, a ruling, a second chance. He listened to every one of them, and then he sold them all concrete. That's not a metaphor. Tom Pendergast was vice president of the ready-mixed concrete company, and through a combination of political control and contractual leverage, his firm supplied the concrete for virtually every significant public works project in Kansas City during the 1930s. The roads, the sidewalks, the county courthouse, City Hall, the Municipal Auditorium, the channel lining of Brush Creek, all poured with Pendergast concrete. He built the city, literally, out of materials he sold to himself. And for a long time, most people in Kansas City were fine with the arrangement. Because here's the thing about Tom Pendergast that makes him different from the other bosses of his era. The buildings he built were actually good. That tension between the genuine beauty of what was constructed and the rot at the center of who ordered it is the whole story of Kansas City in the first half of the 20th century. It is a story about a city that made a deal, and for a generation, the deal seemed to work. The city got roads and parks and some of the finest civic architecture in the Midwest. The boss got rich. The clubs stayed open. The musicians played until dawn. And it all held together the way concrete holds together, until the day it didn't. But Kansas City did not begin with Tom Pendergast. It began, like so many American cities, with geography. Two rivers, the Missouri and the Kansas, meet at nearly a right angle at what was then the western edge of the frontier. And by the 1830s, traders heading west along the Santa Fe Trail recognized that this confluence was the last practical stopping point before the open plains. A trading post became a landing. The landing became a town. The town, incorporated in 1850 with a population of maybe a few hundred souls, sat on bluffs above the river and waited for something to happen. What happened was cattle. After the Civil War, Texas ranchers began driving enormous herds north along the Chisholm Trail to railheads in Kansas, and Kansas City sat at exactly the point where the cattle trails met the railroads heading east. In 1869, the Hannibal Bridge became the first railroad bridge to span the Missouri River, and the following year, a group of railroad executives fenced off 5 acres in the low-lying floodplain below the bluffs, an area called the West Bottoms, and built a series of small stock pens. By 1871, they had expanded to 13 acres. By the 1880s, the Kansas City Stockyards covered over 200 acres and were processing millions of head of livestock per year, second in the nation only to Chicago. In the peak year of 1923, over 2.6 million cattle and nearly 2.8 million hogs passed through the Kansas City yards. Philip Armour opened a packing plant there in 1870. Gustavus Swift followed in 1887 with a 13-acre facility. The city's population, which had been around 4,400 in 1860, exploded past 55,000 by 1880 and reached 160,000 by 1900. The smell, by all accounts, was extraordinary. You could detect the stockyards from miles away on a hot summer day. But nobody much complained because the money was extraordinary, too. At its peak in the 1940s, the livestock trade generated over $350 million annually in exchange. And even decades earlier, it was building a city fast. By 1890, the Kansas City Star could declare with considerable justification that only Chicago surpassed the city as a livestock market, and none rivaled it for energy and speed. The stockyards employed over 20,000 people at their height. 12 railroads, then 34, fed animals into the yards and carried dressed beef out to the rest of the country. The Livestock Exchange Building, completed in 1911, rose 9 stories above the pens. At the time, reportedly one of the tallest buildings in the world dedicated to a single industry. And with that speed came a certain kind of wildness. The West Bottoms were not just stockyards. They were also saloons, gambling dens, brothels, and boarding houses packed with cattlemen, railroad workers, and everyone who made a living separating those men from their wages. Kansas City in the 1880s and 90s was a frontier town scaling up without quite leaving the frontier behind. The original Union Depot, built in 1878 for about $400,000, was a Victorian Gothic confection that critics nicknamed Kansas City's Insane Asylum for its extravagant ornamentation. And the neighborhood around it offered arriving passengers immediate access to every vice the frontier could provide. It was in this environment, muddy streets, open vice, quick money, that the Pendergast machine was born. James Pendergast arrived in Kansas City in 1876, a laborer from St. Joseph with no money and no connections. He got work in the iron foundries and packing houses of the West Bottoms, and according to family legend, though historians have questioned the story, he won a small fortune betting on a horse named Climax at the local racetrack. Whether the horse story is true or embellished, Pendergast acquired a saloon and boarding house on St. Louis Avenue in the West Bottoms around 1881, a place he called the Climax. And he turned out to be very good at the saloon business, not because the whiskey was better, but because Jim Pendergast understood something about the working men who came through his door. They needed things. They needed jobs when the packing houses laid off. They needed someone to cash their paychecks when cash was scarce. They needed coal in winter. They needed someone to talk to the judge when their brother got arrested. Jim provided all of it, and in return he asked only that they vote the way he suggested. By 1892, Jim Pendergast was an alderman representing the First Ward, and his saloon was the unofficial headquarters of what people called the Goat faction of the Democratic Party. So named, supposedly, because the ward's residents kept goats in their yards on the hillsides above the river bottoms. The rival faction, the Rabbits, led by a shrewd operator named Joe Shannon, controlled the south side. The Goats and the Rabbits competed bitterly for patronage, for precinct captains, for the loyalty of every new immigrant family, Irish, Italian, German, Mexican, that settled in the city. Jim ran his operation with generosity and calculation in roughly equal measure. He was well-liked, personally honest in his dealings, and he delivered. He held his council seat for 18 years. Jim Pendergast's health failed in his 50s. He retired in 1910 and died the following year. And by then, his younger brother Tom had been watching, learning, and waiting for over a decade. Tom had come to Kansas City in the 1890s as a teenager, working in Jim's saloon, studying how the machine operated from the inside. Tom was not Jim. Jim was warm, instinctive, a saloon man. Tom was harder, more strategic, more ambitious. He didn't just want a ward, he wanted the city. Tom Pendergast consolidated power through the 19-teens with methodical patience. He won Jim's old council seat in 1911, then gave it up in 1916 to focus entirely on running the Jackson County Democratic Club, the formal party apparatus. He expanded the machine's reach beyond the West Bottoms into the growing neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue. He built alliances with Kansas City's black community, particularly around the 18th and Vine district, offering patronage and protection in exchange for votes. A transactional arrangement, not a principled one, but at the time it was more than most political organizations in Missouri offered. He recruited precinct captains in every neighborhood and ran them like franchise managers, each one responsible for knowing every family on his block, solving their problems, and delivering their votes on Election Day. By 1926, he had co-opted the rival Shannon faction and controlled the unified Kansas City Democratic apparatus outright. And here is the part that reads like a political joke, but actually happened. In 1925, Kansas City adopted a new city charter, establishing a council-manager form of government. The whole point was to professionalize city operations and reduce machine influence. On paper, the city would be run by a nonpartisan city manager hired by a 9-member council. In practice, Pendergast simply made sure his candidates won 5 of those 9 seats, which gave him control of who got hired as manager. The reform, designed to end boss politics, handed him cleaner, more centralized power than he had ever had before. And then came Prohibition. The 18th Amendment took effect in January 1920, and in most American cities it created an underground. Speakeasies behind unmarked doors, bootleggers smuggling liquor from Canada, periodic raids that everyone treated as theater. Kansas City skipped the theater. Under Pendergast's protection, the city simply refused to go dry. Bars continued to operate openly. Liquor flowed in from distilleries in rural Missouri and across state lines. The police, whose chief served at the pleasure of the Pendergast machine, had no interest in enforcement. And federal prohibition agents assigned to Kansas City were so badly outnumbered and so thoroughly stonewalled that their efforts were negligible. The result was a city unlike any other in America during the 20s and 30s. Kansas City was, the term people used then and use now, wide open. Not just alcohol. Gambling halls operated without pretense. The numbers racket ran in every neighborhood. Prostitution was tolerated in designated areas. Nightclubs lined 12th Street from one end to the other, their doors open, their music spilling onto the sidewalks, and the sidewalks so crowded on a Saturday night that you could barely walk. If you were a traveling salesman, a conventioneering elk or Rotarian, a jazz musician looking for a city where the clubs never closed, or a gangster looking for a place where nobody asked too many questions, Kansas City was it. The Hotel Mulebach, the grandest hotel in town, 12 stories at 12th and Baltimore, opened in 1915, did roaring business precisely because the city's reputation drew visitors from everywhere in the heartland. So did the Hotel President, the Hotel Phillips, and half a dozen smaller establishments that catered to the convention trade. People came to Kansas City to do things they could not do at home, and the city was happy to let them, because letting them was good for business, and business was the only morality the machine recognized. The man who managed much of this open vice on Pendergast's behalf was Johnny Lazia, a convicted armed robber whom the machine had helped get paroled. Lazia ran the north side and controlled the gambling, narcotics, and liquor operations there, with Pendergast's blessing. In return, Lazia delivered votes, muscle, and connections to national organized crime figures reaching from Chicago to New York. This arrangement, the political boss, the mob lieutenant, the compliant police, was the architecture of lawlessness. It was not chaos. It was a system, and it ran smoothly. And the man at the top of it also happened to be a compulsive gambler who loved horse racing more than almost anything in the world. Remember that. It matters later. Now here is where the story gets complicated, because the same man running this system simultaneously embarked on one of the most ambitious civic improvement programs in American history. In 1931, Kansas City voters approved a massive bond issue, approximately $50 million, an enormous sum in the first years of the Depression, to fund what was called the 10-year plan. The plan called for new roads, bridges, parks, a water treatment plant, a city hall, a municipal auditorium, a police headquarters, and improvements to the boulevard and park system originally designed by the landscape architect George Kessler, whose earlier plans had already given Kansas City one of the finest networks of parkways in the country. The timing was, from Pendergast's perspective, exquisite. The Depression had thrown thousands out of work, and the 10-year plan meant jobs, real jobs, building real things, right when people needed them most. Kansas City's charter actually forbade the use of taxes for direct relief, so you couldn't set up a soup kitchen with city funds, but you could hire a man to pour concrete. And the concrete, of course, came from ready-mix. The buildings that went up were not cheap imitations. Kansas City City Hall, completed in 1937, was a soaring structure designed by the architectural firm of White and White, one of the tallest city halls in the country, clad in limestone, Art Deco in its detailing, with a grand observation deck and interiors finished in marble and bronze. The Jackson County Courthouse, completed in 1934 just across 12th Street, was a similarly imposing Art Deco tower. Its construction had been overseen by the presiding county judge, a quiet, bespectacled man from Independence named Harry Truman, who had insisted on hiring a real architect and building something that would last. Truman ran the project honestly, came in close to budget, and was known for refusing to skim. The Municipal Auditorium, designed by the firms of Hoyt, Price and Barnes, and Gentry, Voskamp and Neville, opened in 1935 as one of the largest civic arenas in the country, its streamlined, modern facade stretching across an entire city block. People took to calling City Hall and the courthouse Pendergast's Pyramids, a wry acknowledgment of who really ran things. But nobody said they were ugly. These were not patronage shacks. They were buildings designed to announce that Kansas City was a real city, a permanent city, and anyone who doubted it could come stand in the lobby of City Hall and look up. But the concrete that held them together came from Tom Pendergast's company. The contracts that paid for them flowed through Tom Pendergast's machine, and the votes that approved them were counted by Tom Pendergast's precinct captains. This was the deal Kansas City had made, and in the early 30s, standing in the atrium of a brand-new city hall while the rest of the country was selling apples on street corners, it was hard to argue the deal was not working. Meanwhile, in the clubs along 12th Street and down around 18th and Vine, something was happening that no political boss planned or controlled. Kansas City was becoming one of the most important jazz cities in the world. The reason was simple. The clubs never closed. In a wide-open city, there were no curfew laws, no 2 a.m. last calls, no Sunday blue laws. A musician could start playing at 10 in the evening and not stop until 5 or 6 in the morning. This attracted players from all over the Midwest and the South, men and women who wanted a city where they could play as long as they wanted, as loud as they wanted, in front of audiences who were drinking real liquor and ready to listen all night. By the best estimates, Kansas City had somewhere between 150 and 200 music venues at its height. The result was a distinctive Kansas City jazz style, looser, bluesier, more riff-driven than what you heard in New York or Chicago. Extended jam sessions, what musicians called cutting contests, became legendary. A horn player might get on the bandstand at midnight and not leave until dawn, trading solos with 5 or 6 other musicians, each one trying to outplay the last. The 18th and Vine district was the center of black Kansas City, a self-contained neighborhood of churches, barbershops, newspapers, the Black Musicians Union, Local 627, and by the early 30s, an extraordinary concentration of talent. Count Basie, who had come to Kansas City by way of New Jersey, and the Oklahoma-based Blue Devils Band, led a group at the Reno Club, a small segregated joint at 12th and Cherry that paid almost nothing but let the band play whatever it wanted. The Reno was not fancy. The main floor was for white customers. The balcony and a small space behind the band were for black customers. But the music was incandescent. In 1936, experimental radio broadcasts from the Reno Club sent Basie's sound out into the night, and the music critic and producer John Hammond, listening to one of those broadcasts, heard something he had to pursue. Within a year, he had Basie signed to a national recording contract. That broadcast, a small band in a basement-level club in a wide-open city, heard by a man hundreds of miles away who happened to be listening, is one of the hinge moments in American music. Charlie Parker grew up in Kansas City, learning his saxophone in the clubs around 18th and Vine as a teenager in the mid-30s. Big Joe Turner tended bar and sang, his voice so large he barely needed a microphone. Mary Lou Williams arranged for Andy Kirk's band and became one of the most respected composers in jazz. Pete Johnson's boogie-woogie piano could make a room vibrate. Kansas City did not create jazz. New Orleans and Chicago were there first. But it created a version of jazz that was raw, more spontaneous, more rooted in the blues, and it sent that music out into the world. All of it made possible because a political boss had decided the clubs would stay open and the police would stay away. Art made possible by corruption. Even at the time, people understood the irony. On the morning of June 17, 1933, the contradictions of Pendergast's Kansas City collided in the most public way imaginable. Frank Nash was a federal prisoner, a convicted bank robber who had escaped from Leavenworth and been recaptured by FBI agents in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The agents were transporting him back to Leavenworth and brought him through Union Station, that magnificent Beaux-Arts terminal that the Chicago architect Jarvis Hunt had designed and which had opened on October 30th, 1914, at a final cost of some $6 million, part of a broader $50 million railroad infrastructure investment that had reshaped the city's center. The station's grand hall had a 95-foot ceiling, 3 enormous chandeliers, a 6-foot clock, and during the peak war years of 1945, it would process nearly 680,000 passengers. Over 200 trains a day had once passed through its platforms. It was a building designed to make you feel small and awed, a monument to the idea that Kansas City was not a cattle town anymore, but a real American metropolis. Outside the east entrance, in the parking area, Nash's escorts loaded him into a waiting Chevrolet. And then gunmen, led by Vernon Miller, with Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Richetti alleged to have participated, though Floyd denied it to his dying breath, opened fire. When it was over, 4 lawmen were dead. FBI agent Raymond Caffrey, Oklahoma Police Chief Otto Reed, and Kansas City detectives William Grooms and Frank Hermanson. Frank Nash was dead, too, killed in the crossfire that was supposed to free him. The event became known as the Union Station Massacre, and it shocked the country. Machine guns in a train station parking lot, in broad daylight in a major American city. Bullet marks scarred the station's limestone exterior. The full truth of who planned the attack and why has been debated for decades, but the implication was not debatable. Kansas City had become a place where armed men could ambush federal officers at one of the busiest train stations in America, and the local power structure had either enabled it or failed to prevent it. The massacre gave J. Edgar Hoover the ammunition he needed to expand the FBI's powers, including the authority for agents to carry firearms and make arrests. Johnny Latzia, Pendergast's mob connection, was suspected of involvement, or at least of being the local facilitator. Latzia was never charged. On a July night in 1934, gunmen shot and killed him in front of his apartment building, and the machine absorbed the loss and moved on. Less than 4 months before Latzia's murder, on March 27, 1934, Kansas City held a municipal election that became known as the Bloody Election. Pendergast's candidates needed to win, and the machine deployed its full apparatus. Repeat voters, ghost registrations, intimidation at the polls. But a reform movement had organized and was contesting the machine's control. The reform candidate for mayor, A. Ross Hill, contacted the governor and asked him to call in the National Guard. The governor refused. What followed was not subtle. The Associated Press described it this way: the Pendergast machine rode to overwhelming victory after a blood-stained election marked by 4 killings, scores of sluggings, and machine gun terrorism. Among the dead was a 78-year-old hardware dealer named P.W. Oldham, shot near his store on Swope Parkway, 2 doors from a polling place. 11 more people were hospitalized. Thugs shot up a Kansas City Star reporter's car and chased him back to the newspaper building. The Pendergast candidates won overwhelmingly. In some precincts, the vote totals for machine candidates exceeded the total population. The blatancy of it, the dead bodies at polling places, the vote totals that exceeded physical possibility, finally triggered federal attention that could not be deflected. Over the next several years, more than 250 people would be convicted of vote fraud charges in Kansas City. The convictions chipped away at the machine's mid-level operatives, the precinct captains and ward bosses who were its connective tissue. But Pendergast himself remained untouchable, or so it seemed. In fact, Tom Pendergast was destroying himself, and the instrument of destruction was the same one that had launched his brother's career half a century earlier: gambling. Tom Pendergast loved horse racing the way an addict loves the substance that is killing him. He bet enormous sums, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, on a single race through bookmakers across the country. And he lost. By the mid-1930s, his gambling debts were mounting into catastrophic territory. Some accounts put his cumulative losses over the decade in the millions. The concrete company was profitable, and the machine provided income through various enterprises, including a refuse collection monopoly and a wholesale liquor business. But the legitimate revenue could not cover losses at the scale Pendergast was generating. He had even formed a jockey club and a horse breeding operation in Clay County, as if proximity to the horses might somehow reverse the mathematics of compulsion. It did not. The man who controlled every deal in Kansas City could not control the one transaction that mattered most to him. So Pendergast looked for other sources of money. In 1935, he brokered a deal involving fire insurance companies doing business in Missouri. The companies had been in a rate dispute with the state superintendent of insurance, and Pendergast arranged for a settlement favorable to the companies. In return, he received a payment of approximately $315,000, which he did not report on his income taxes. The transaction was, at its core, a straightforward bribe, and it was the kind of financial crime that federal prosecutors could trace, prove, and present to a jury without needing to untangle the larger web of patronage and influence. The Treasury Department's Intelligence Unit, the same unit that had brought down Al Capone, began investigating Pendergast in 1938. The investigation was accelerated when Missouri Governor Lloyd Stark, whom Pendergast himself had helped elect in 1936, turned against the machine and supported the federal probe. Pendergast had made the governor, and the governor unmade him. In 1939, Pendergast's own secretary-treasurer, Edward Schneider, who managed 8 of his businesses, killed himself. Whether from guilt or fear of what the investigation would reveal, nobody can say for certain. On April 7, 1939, Tom Pendergast was indicted for income tax evasion on $443,550 in unreported income, including the insurance bribe. He pleaded guilty on May 22nd and was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison and 5 years of probation, during which he was forbidden to engage in political activity. He was 67 years old, recently diagnosed with colon cancer, and broken. The sentencing was held in a federal courthouse in Kansas City. Nobody recorded whether the concrete in that building came from ready-mixed. But nobody who lived through those years would have been surprised to learn that it did. Pendergast's fall did not happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of one of the most remarkable political stories in American history, because the man Pendergast had sponsored more than any other, the man he had backed for county judge, boosted to the United States Senate, and supported at every turn, was Harry S. Truman. Truman's relationship with the Pendergast machine is one of those facts that seems impossible until you understand Kansas City. Truman was not corrupt. Every serious historical account agrees on this. He did not take bribes, did not skim from contracts, did not enrich himself through public office. When he oversaw the construction of the Jackson County Courthouse, he ran the project honestly and produced a building that still stands. He was a machine politician who was personally clean, and in Kansas City that was not a contradiction. It was, in a strange way, how the machine worked. Pendergast needed some men who were honest, because an organization that was corrupt at every single level could not function at all. Truman was useful precisely because he was trustworthy. When Pendergast went to prison, Truman was a sitting United States Senator who owed his career to a convicted felon. In Washington, the senator from Pendergast label clung to him like mud. Pendergast had backed Truman for the Senate seat in 1934 only after several other candidates turned him down. By some accounts, Pendergast considered Truman something of a lightweight. But Truman won the primary, won the general election, and served ably, if quietly. His re-election in 1940 came by a narrow margin, saved partly because the federal prosecutor who had brought down Pendergast also entered the race and split the anti-machine vote. Many expected Truman's career to end there. In his second term, though, with Pendergast out of power and World War II underway, Truman built a national reputation chairing a Senate committee that investigated waste and fraud in military spending, a subject on which a man from the Pendergast machine had, perhaps, an unusual education. In 1944, he was selected as Franklin Roosevelt's running mate, and when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Harry Truman, the product of one of the most corrupt political machines in American history, became the 33rd President of the United States. Tom Pendergast did not live to see it. He died on January 26, 1945, at his home on Ward Parkway, a grand boulevard his machine had helped build through one of the finest residential neighborhoods in the city. He was 72. Vice President Truman, who had held the office for barely a week, attended the funeral. He was reportedly the only elected official who did. When criticized for going, Truman said simply, "He was always my friend, and I have always been his." After Pendergast, Kansas City tried to become a normal city. A reform administration came in, cleaned up the police department, closed many of the gambling operations, and enforced the closing laws that had been ignored for 20 years. The clubs along 12th Street went dark. The Reno Club, where Basie had played, was shut down in 1939. The musicians who had stayed because the city let them play drifted to New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, where the recording studios and the national audiences were. Charlie Parker left Kansas City in 1939 and never came back except to visit. Count Basie's band had been a national act for years by then. The sound Kansas City had incubated, that loose, riff-heavy, blues-drenched swing, did not die, but it did not belong to Kansas City anymore. The Stockyards, which had been the economic engine that built the city in the first place, continued their slow fade. The Great Flood of 1951 devastated the West Bottoms. Water 15 to 30 feet deep swept through the same lowlands where Jim Pendergast had once run his saloon, killing livestock by the hundreds of thousands and wrecking the infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Many of the packing plants closed rather than rebuild. The economics of the industry were shifting anyway. Farmers began negotiating directly with packers or selling through small regional auction barns, cutting out the Kansas City middleman. By 1984, stock receipts had dwindled to nearly zero. The last cattle auction was held in September 1991, and then the yards closed for good, ending 120 years of continuous operation. Everything of value was sold at auction, and what remained of the once proud Kansas City Stockyards was demolished. The West Bottoms, which had made Kansas City rich, became warehouses and empty lots, and eventually a weekend antiques district where people browse for vintage furniture in buildings that once smelled of blood and hay. The city's population continued to grow past 500,000 by mid-century, but the growth was suburban, spreading south and east, not filling in the old core. The pattern was familiar from a dozen other American cities in the post-war years. Highways punched through old neighborhoods. Shopping centers pulled retail to the edges. The tax base dispersed, and downtown grew quieter decade by decade. Interstate 70 cut through the 18th and Vine neighborhood, and urban renewal programs in the 1950s and 60s tore down the blocks where the all-night jam sessions had once shaken the walls. Union Station, where 4 lawmen had died in 1933, declined along with the railroads it was built to serve. At its wartime peak, hundreds of thousands of passengers had passed through annually, soldiers going to war, soldiers coming home. By the 1970s, the airlines and the interstate highways had drained it dry. That grand hall, with its 95-foot ceiling, was largely empty, the limestone streaked with grime, the chandeliers dark. Amtrak discontinued service in 1985, and the building sat vacant, deteriorating, its future uncertain. There were proposals to demolish it, proposals to convert it, proposals to simply let it rot. A bi-state tax initiative, the first voter-approved sales tax for historic preservation in the country, finally funded a full restoration, and Union Station reopened on November 10, 1999, as a museum and event space. The ceiling is still 95 feet high. The chandeliers burn again. Bullet pockmarks from the massacre, some people claim, can still be seen on an exterior wall near the east entrance. The parking area where the shooting happened is still a parking area. The Hotel Muleback changed hands, changed names, was folded into a Marriott. 18th and Vine became a designated historic jazz district with the American Jazz Museum and a visitor center, and the careful, slightly too clean feeling that heritage districts tend to have when the thing they are memorializing was wild and messy and up past 4 in the morning. The site of the Reno Club, where Count Basie's band was discovered via a late-night radio broadcast that changed American music, 602 East 12th Street, is a police parking lot. Kansas City City Hall still stands at 12th and Oak, still the seat of city government, still Art Deco, still imposing. The observation deck closed to the public years ago, but the building endures because it was well built by a real architect with real materials to real specifications. Tom Pendergast's office at 1908 Main Street still stands, too, a modest 2-story yellow brick building in what is now the Crossroads Arts District, surrounded by galleries and coffee shops and the gentle commerce of a neighborhood that has been carefully, tastefully revived. There is no plaque on the building explaining what happened upstairs. The linen supply company is long gone. The line of men waiting for favors is long gone. The man who ran Kansas City for 15 years from that cramped second-floor room left behind one monument that no reform movement could undo, the concrete itself. It is in the sidewalks. It is in the bridge abutments. It is in the courthouse walls and the creek channels and the roads that still carry traffic through a city that has spent the better part of a century trying to figure out what it is without the man who poured it. The concrete holds. It does not explain itself. It does not apologize. It just holds.